This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor of social psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Yuqi Liu, a UQ psychology student.
And I'm Ellen Griffith-Spears, and I teach environmental history and policy at the University of Alabama in our undergraduate New College and the Department of American Studies.
And what we're doing today is we're part of a project recording introductory videos for all 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we're recording for Chapter 4, The Tar Wars and Climate Justice Activism in North America, a transboundary movement linking the US and Canada. And we're lucky enough to have the author of the chapter here, Professor Spears. So I guess we all have some questions about the chapter.
Yeah, so Professor Spear, the first question may I ask is that what is tar sand?
Well, the tar sands region of Alberta, Canada, is a locale in Western Canada. It is the home of the Athabascan and Beaver Lake Cree Nation, and it is being rapidly exploited and the land very much degraded by possibly the largest oil sands mining operation in the world. And the oil sands are, it's not like there's a pool of oil under the earth that they're tapping, and the oil is held in rock. And so as it comes out, it's very heavy crude oil. It takes a lot of processing. And the process is very degrading to this landscape.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So it sounds really like environmental unfriendly. So like, is there any like environmental activism do something like to against with these like polluted activities?
Yes, there is major environmental activism both in the US and Canada, and they have allies in Europe and around the world. And I focused mainly in this chapter on the relationship between US and Canada and the pipeline movement, the anti-pipeline movement, because one of the features of oil extraction generally is that you have to have a way to carry it somewhere else. And some of it is trucked out, but a lot of it is taken out through pipelines. And so we've seen a major rise in environmental activism around the pipelines in both the US and Canada. And as that oil industry has grown, the activism, the connections between activists in the US and Canada have very much increased.
And in the chapter, you really cover the history of those protests in some detail, right? But the short version is that the tactics are incredibly diverse, and they've ranged, from protests to blockades to camps and standoff with troopers and the police. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, that's right. I mean, one of the features of having pipelines is it spreads the health and environmental consequences of oil sands mining to places all across both countries where that oil is going. And that has generated a lot of activism. Some people are motivated by concerns about the climate and believe that it's important to keep that oil in the ground in order not to have temperature rise so drastically. Other people are motivated because the pipeline may be crossing their land. And that's true of farmers in the American Midwest and in other Canadian provinces, but it's taken a particular impact on the Standing Rock community in the Dakotas. And that has been really a major focus of the organizing in both the US and Canada, is to try to stop the Keystone XL as a branch of the pipeline going south, the pipeline through Standing Rock. And now even since this chapter, the focus has moved to Line 3, which is another pipeline that goes across the northern states and Canada. And so that Standing Rock focus was an important one for me in this chapter because it points to the importance of environmental justice more generally and of tribal sovereignty in particular. The Standing Rock Sioux and their—
Sorry, just to jump in, I think that's such an important point, and maybe we could take 30 seconds to put this in context, because the environmental movement in America and the Canada has kind of historically been about preserving the wilderness, but without engaging the injustice and inequality and colonial history of the countries. And that's been challenged in the last 10 years. And you talk about that, and in particular, how Indigenous leadership has been important in the environmental movement here. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's really been a seismic shift in environmentalism that I would say that is a long history of both Native American, African American, Latino activists in the Southwest, long before we called it environmental justice. But beginning in the 1980s, there was a vigorous, with the book, several chapters talk about the transformation of the movement, and there was a vigorous transformation of the environmental movement in the United States, Canada, other places around the world, South Africa and others, to say it's not just about wilderness, it's protecting the wilderness, certainly that's important, but it's about protecting the places where people actually live. And the focus on campaigns like Standing Rock have taken that even further to say it's not only about inequality generally, but it's looking at the relationships between nations, sovereignty. These Oshedishakwen, the 7 tribes that come together in that area of the northern Midwest of the US and southern Canada, that's their ancestral land. And so this has a particular impact. We'd also talk in the book several places about framing. And so environmental justice was a big reframing of the environmental movement. But the Standing Rock Sioux reframed the issue there. It's about water protection. The pipeline goes right under their half-mile from where people live, right under their water supply as it crosses under the Missouri River.
And I think you've had, like you describe in the chapter, many successes as well as setbacks from the pipeline struggles. Can you tell us a little bit about what lessons we might draw as activists from the struggles? What are some of the strengths of the movement? And you've talked about one, which was a frame that could bring together people across the divide, bringing together conservative farmers and Indigenous groups, people from communities of color.
That's right. And I think the coalition building that was done, Indigenous leadership certainly was the critical central factor, but there were multiple allies. The list of groups is quite amazing. There was Cowboy Indian Alliance, and they worked.
I have to jump in and ask you to explain that, because that's just such a controversial phrase for people that don't know what it is. Cowboy Indian Alliance. Yeah, what is that?
Well, I mean, the idea is that people are coming together, and we wasn't without tension around Standing Rock. Thousands of allies, 5,000 to 10,000 people might be there at a given time in 2016. And not everybody understood the centrality of Native sovereignty and Native leadership. And so people, young white activists from across the country, learned a lot about how it is to be a good ally, what kinds of things, what kinds of support people need and want, and that they can provide. The other groups included the Idle No More group from Canada, and this is a group of women who it's really an organization and a movement in Canada And they had a big influence, cultural influence on the Canadian environmental movement more generally. The Society to Protect Indigenous Rights and Indigenous Treaties, Clean Energy Future, Oklahoma Sierra Club. So they were involved in the Keystone fight. And you mentioned there were victories. The Standing Rock Pipeline is functioning right now without a permit, so essentially illegally. But the Keystone XL, the northern leg of that, has been stopped. A couple of pipelines in Appalachian region have been halted. And the more recent one is in around Memphis, Tennessee, that was slated to go through African-American South Memphis. The Byhalia pipeline has also been halted. The purveyor of that pulled out due to protests. So it's a long haul. You mentioned multiple tactics have really been necessary, from negotiation and protest. The Standing Rock people withstood fire hoses and attack dogs. It was recent. I'm in Alabama, reminiscent of the brutality of the U.S. civil rights movement. And they have, in many cases, by building coalitions, have stood together and won these victories.
I guess that's a wonderful way to finish this part one of our conversation. So if I can summarize what I heard you say, it was partly about finding a frame that could bring together the different, communities, and that involved people from the traditional environmental movement that was more white-centered and racist and, disconnected, recognizing that was actually a problem, that they needed to surrender leadership to people from communities that were affected and to get behind them and learn and support them. And also recognizing that it is a struggle with ups and downs, and that we have to see both the victories and the defeats as momentary and sometimes fleeting, as you say at one point, and be prepared for an ongoing struggle, because the industry is always waiting to push back, including if there's a lack of enforcement, to operate in ways that are not legal. So it's about coming together for a long haul. That's what I took from it anyways. Yuchi, what about you?
No, that's great. Yes,
Yeah.
I do too. And as conditions have changed, the war in Ukraine has put incredible pressure on oil production.
True.
And so conditions have changed, and it's just redoubling those efforts to work for a climate sound future, even under great duress.
Yeah. And I want to give some voice to Yuchi there. Like, what are your final thoughts or final questions in the context of this chapter? What did you take from it?
Yeah, so my thoughts about this chapter is more like this Star War, not only just protect the environment, but more united different race, together to fight with these common enemies. And this could help America to solve these the historical issue, and which also is the main issue in American societies. That's what I found, and it's very interesting. And also I would like to ask Professor Spear about just an extra question, the Iraqi, the American and Iraqi war, it's also someone in my country says it's about the oil problem. So I just would like to know, is there alternative, the oil supply would help to protect the both environment in American and Canadian, and would that be a new colonialization of the other country, just like the President Roosevelt said in the history? Yeah. Thank you.
I think we're going far beyond the chapter there, so I'll defer to you, Professor Spears, on whether you want to engage those complex issues. But I think if my understanding of what Yuchi is saying is, can you locate this struggle in the context of American imperialism abroad? Which I'll leave it to you if you'd like to or not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in a longer version, we would go into some more depth about the history of colonialism. That 49th parallel, the US and Canada share the longest land border of any two countries in the world. They both have a history of settler colonialism. They both are deeply steeped in injustice in that past. And certainly that has characterized, and I can speak as a US citizen, that has characterized US relationships abroad. And oil, had energy, the energy future has been an important part of that. And one of your points, I think, is, well, what do we do about that? And it is, there's a multifaceted answer, but one of them is something that environmental activists of all persuasions have been advocating, which is to move away from fossil fuels and move toward renewables. And young activists have been a key part of making that happen. The levels of divestment are quite remarkable from these educational institutions, from foundations, and big investment companies even now are looking to invest in places and in energy strategies that are better for the planet and then the people who inhabit it.
And that's certainly something we see in Australia, where it's anticipated we might hit 50% renewable energy this decade, which would be a wonderful achievement. And
that's exciting and
it is
example
exciting
for others. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me close this part one portion by saying thank you to Professor Spears and to you, Yuchi. Thank you for being here in the recording. And thank you to our viewers for being with us today.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ. And check out our website for more videos.